I'm going to talk, as David said, about the right to sustainable development. This is within the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which some of you might be aware of is sort of the master international treaty under which all climate change negotiations, at least under the UN auspices, take place. And they have periodic meetings. There was a meeting in Cancun last year, or sorry, the meeting in Copenhagen last year in 2009. There's another meeting in Cancun at the end of this month. And these are the meetings at which they're attempting to hammer out a post-Kyoto protocol treaty for international, to govern climate change internationally. The outline of the talk is up there for you to see. I'll come back to that at various points in the talk so you know where I'm headed, or where I should be headed at least, and I'll try to remind you what we've done and where we're going. First, I want to talk to you about what I call the institutional conception of the right to sustainable development. And when I say institutional conception, I mean something rather specific. I mean that the content given to this right to sustainable development by means of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself, and also as a result of various UN documents that speak about the right to sustainable development. So I'm not drawing this concept out of philosophical error and trying to give content to it, but I'm looking at what seems to be the content of the right in specific international and important international documents. The place in which it arises most prominently in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is in Article 3, Paragraph 4, in which it says the parties have the right to and should promote sustainable development. Policies and measures to protect the climate system against human-induced change should be appropriate for the specific conditions of each party and should be integrated with national development programs, taking into account that economic development is essential for adopting measures to address climate change. So this is listed in the United Nations Framework Convention, and I'll just refer to that by short as the convention, as an important normative touchstone for any climate change treaty. Any climate change treaty is meant to respect this right to sustainable development. So the negotiations that are going on in Cancun, for example, at the end of this month, are meant to be governed by this right to sustainable development. But what is it? What's the content of the right? Well, as it turns out, this has been a matter of discussion and debate within United Nations circles for some time. Going back, for example, to 1987 with the publication of what was then referred to as the report on the World Commission on Environment and Development, but which has come to be called the Brundtland Commission report. The notion of sustainable development is expressed there as sustainable development implies meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the idea here is that sustainable development has, at its core, an intergenerational aspect to it. That the meeting of present needs are constrained by the meeting of future needs. So there's an aspect of sustainable development that covers this intergenerational time period, and that's what I would refer to as the sustainable part of sustainable development. Now notice that the Brundtland Commission report refers to meeting of needs. As it turns out, in the United Nations Framework Convention documents, meeting of needs is not what is taken to be the most important aspect of sustainable development, but it's rather poverty alleviating economic growth. So you see then in the United Nations, in the Convention preamble, taking into full account the legitimate priority needs of developing countries for the achievement of sustained economic growth, not needs, but sustained economic growth, and the eradication of poverty. So the eradication of poverty is part of sustained economic growth, and the eradication of poverty, rather than the meeting of needs, is what's focused on in the preamble. That all countries, especially developing countries, need access to resources required to achieve sustainable social and economic development, and that in order for developing countries to progress towards that goal, their energy consumption will need to grow. So in the convention itself, there's reference to the consumption of energy and the need for it to grow in order to sustain this rapid economic growth and to alleviate poverty. So there's a change of emphasis then from the Brundtland Commission to the convention, a change of emphasis from meeting needs to rapid economic growth and poverty alleviation. That's the development part of the right to sustainable development. So we have the sustainable part, which has this intergenerational focus. We have the development part, which is geared towards rapid economic growth and poverty alleviation. And the other thing that I would just like to point out about this, which for better or for worse, and whether or not you think it's for better or for worse, is something that you might have opinions about. But for better or for worse, this right is understood entirely anthropocentrically. That is to say that sustainable development is not about sustaining ecosystems because ecosystems are thought of as good in some way or valuable in some way. Quite the contrary, the idea of sustainable development is directed towards the interests of human beings, at least as it's understood in this institutional context. This couldn't be more explicit than it is in the Brundtland Commission report, which says that every ecosystem everywhere cannot be preserved intact. A forest may be depleted in one part of the watershed and extended elsewhere, which is not a bad thing. So the idea is that there's no inherent value to that forest apart from the value that it offers to human beings, which is not a bad thing if the exploitation has been planned and the effects of soil erosion rates, water regimes, and genetic losses have been taken into account. So what I'm calling the institutional conception of the right to sustainable development then has this intergenerational aspect to it. That's the sustainable part of it. It's focused towards rapid economic growth and poverty alleviation. That's the development part of it. And those are, in effect, the only concerns. The only concerns are anthropocentric concerns. It's also a group right. The right, as it's expressed in the convention, is a right of parties. And the parties to the convention are states. It's not a right possessed by individuals, but it's a right possessed by states. Now, that's consistent with UN documents that talk about the rights of states, particularly the rights of states to sovereignty, to self-determination, and to the disposal of their own natural resources. So the two most important human rights documents, other than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are the conventions on the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which are meant to sort of flesh out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most of what's said in both of those documents refers to the rights of individuals. But right up front, in the very beginning of both of those documents, there's this emphasis placed upon the rights of states. The rights of states to self-determination and the rights of states to use their resources as they see fit. This idea that states have a right to sustainable development then, as it's expressed in the convention, is perfectly consistent with a body of UN understanding about the rights of states. And in that sense, at least, in that context at least, it's not controversial to make the claim. So what is the intergenerational constraint that's established by sustainability? How is it understood institutionally? Well then, going back to the Brundtland Commission, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5, they express it as follows. Living standards that go beyond the basic minimum are sustainable only if consumption standards everywhere have regard for long-term sustainability. Now, there's something that I think is valuable in that expression, and there's something that I think is confused in that expression. What I think is valuable in that expression is that it sees sustainability, at least with respect to certain kinds of resources, global resources such as the atmosphere, it sees sustainability as a property that attaches to global policy and not just, or international policy, if you will, and not a property that attaches just to the policy of any particular state. Sustainability isn't something that's a matter of a particular state's policy, but it's a matter of international or global policy. I think that that's right when we're looking at a global resource like the atmosphere or like the climate. But I think that what's problematic with this expression is it tends to produce a regress problem. If a particular state's policies are sustainable only if a particular other set of states' policies are sustainable, then we have to ask ourselves what makes those states sustainable, and we end up going back and back and back, and there doesn't look as if there's any particular stopping point. And that's problematic. That's a problematic aspect of the expression there. I think that what we can learn from the expression, though, is that when we think about sustainability with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, what we should be interested in are not the emissions of any particular state, but we should be interested in the global package, all of the emissions in any given year. And the way that this has come to be understood as a constraint, again in this context, is as a constraint to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius or 3.4 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of this century. This is something that the European Union several years ago adopted. It's something that many international NGOs were trying to have the international community adopt as a goal. And it's something that then was adopted, if one can use that language with respect to the Copenhagen Accord. It's unclear whether that's the appropriate language to use. But there was a document that came out of the Copenhagen meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change last December at the behest of several states, including the United States, in which this 2 degree Celsius warming limit was accepted. So the idea here is that the intergenerational constraint with respect to energy policy, and in particular with the emission of greenhouse gases, is one that should control emissions and concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere such that the warming that occurs over the course of this century not raise the mean temperature of the planet more than 2 degrees centigrade. And the thing that's problematic about that from a policy perspective is that we're almost there at this point. That we've already warmed the planet 0.7 to 0.8 degrees since pre-industrial times, and scientists who research this believe that there's already a 1 degree warming built into the system through the thermal inertia of the ocean. So we're probably already committed to something like 1.7 or 1.8 degrees warming. If we want to hit the 2 degree limit, then we have quite a challenge ahead of us. Okay, so I take myself to have said something perhaps helpful about the institutional conception of the right to sustainable development. I now want to say something to you about what I think the policy constraints, what sort of constraints this right places on policies, and policies both domestically and globally. So, if we accept that the intergenerational aspect of this right should be something like the 2 degrees Celsius limit, then we need to ask ourselves what that means with respect to CO2 emissions. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, how many of you know what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is? A few of you? Half of you? Good. Okay, so very briefly, this is a panel of climate experts from around the world who meet. They don't do independent research, but they collate the research of the best climate science that's gone on over the period of the last 4 to 5 years, and they issue documents that kind of give us the state of the science of climate science. The last document was issued in 2007. It's called the Fourth Assessment Report, or AR4 for short. In AR4, the IPCC says that to achieve this 2 degree warming limit, it's actually, I think, a range of 1.8 to 2.4 degrees is how they express it there. We need to reduce global emissions against the year 2000 baseline by 50 to 85% by the year 2050. So we have to engage globally in a very aggressive project of reducing CO2 emissions. And again, notice that when I talk about sustainability here, I'm talking about it as a global project. I'm talking about what the international community should be committed to with respect to CO2 emissions. That doesn't tell us what any particular state should be committed to at this point, right? This is a matter of international policy. But then think about the other aspect of the right to sustainable development. Think about the development aspect of that right. And recall that the development aspect of that right is directed towards rapid economic growth in order to alleviate poverty. And ask ourselves, how much CO2 does a state need in order to reach a state of very high human development? Now, I'm not an energy specialist. If there are energy specialists in the audience, I'll be particularly interested in hearing from you during the discussion period. But the way I approach that question is as follows. I say, let's turn to the Human Development Index, which is the index that is put together by the United Nations Development Program. And it's an index that ranks all states in the world according to their level of human development. Now, human development isn't just understood as economic growth. Actually, human development is a metric that's composed of three or four different factors. There's a factor, I say 3 or 4 because one of the factors itself is compound. But there's a factor that has to do with per capita income. There's a factor that has to do with health outcomes. And there's a factor that has to do with educational attainments in a state. And these factors are weighted. We look at all states with respect to these factors. They're weighted, and then they rank the states ordinally according to how high they're developed. The top 38 states in this category are in a category, or in this list, are in a category that's labeled as highest developed states. And these range from Norway in first place all the way down to Malta in 38th place. The United States is 13th, Singapore 23rd. So the numbers on the left-hand column there represent their ranking in the Human Development Index. Singapore 23rd, South Korea 26th, Portugal 34. So I suggest we turn to this list, we look at the highest developed states in the world, and we look at what their CO2 emissions are like. Now here we have to look at their per capita emissions, not their total emissions. Because if we look at their total emissions, we won't properly control for population size. So what's interesting here when we ask ourselves how much CO2 do you have to emit, how does the state have to emit, is the question of what the per capita emissions of the state are rather than the total emissions of the state. And if you go down the list, what you see is that Norway emits 8.7 metric tons per person, MT, metric tons per person. The United States is rather high, 19.1 metric tons per person. Singapore, remarkably higher, significantly higher still. South Korea coming back down to 11.2, Portugal 5.4, Malta 7.9. I picked these out for these states out for reasons. Well, some of the reasons will become clear in a moment. I picked out Norway just because it's highest, most highly developed. Malta because it's the bottom of this list. I picked out Portugal because Portugal has the lowest per capita emissions amongst the highest developed states. So you might think on the basis of that the highest level of human development requires CO2 emissions of 5.4 metric tons per person. Now, of course, if you think that, of course, you're also making some assumptions. You're making some assumptions that we're talking about current technology, that there's not going to be a rapid technological breakthrough, and we're talking about more or less current pricing mechanisms for fossil fuels. But the problem with drawing that conclusion, I think, is that when you begin to compare Portugal to other states that have developed very rapidly, very recently, what you see is that their per capita emissions are much higher. So take South Korea and Singapore. Now maybe Singapore is a bit of an outlier here because Singapore relies very heavily on importing a lot of oil, refining the oil, and then exporting it again, and that's a very CO2 intensive way of achieving economic development. So focus instead on South Korea. About 30 years ago, 20 to 30 years ago, South Korea was squarely in the middle of the 180 countries on the list of the Human Development Index list. They were at number 100. They were at the same place as Jamaica. South Korea has achieved a remarkable degree of human development over the course of 20 to 30 years, whereas Jamaica has not. Right? How did they do that? How much CO2 did they need in order to do that? Well, they are currently at 11.2 metric tons per person. You might think that it takes more CO2 to achieve a high level of human development, more CO2 emissions to achieve a high level of human development than it does to maintain a high level of human development, like Portugal. Maybe the process of achieving human development is more energy intensive and carbon intensive than the process of maintaining it, because once you're there, you can make investments in greener sources of energy that you can't make on the way to getting there if you're going to get there in a rapid amount of time. So I suggest that this is inconclusive, but one thing to think about is that in order to achieve the highest level of human development, it looks plausible that states require something in the range between Portugal and South Korea. Something in the range of 5 to 11 metric tons of CO2 per person. Again, assuming existing technology and existing pricing mechanisms. That becomes important for reasons that I'll point out in just a second. All right, so where are we? In the year 2000, remember we're trying to achieve a 50 to 85% reduction against 2000 levels, right? In the year 2000, the population was more or less 6 billion people. Per capita emissions in the year 2000 were 3.92 metric tons. Jumping forward to 2050, we expect there to be 9 billion people on the planet. Demographers estimate that there will be 9 billion people on the planet, and the sort of cautiously optimistic scenario is that that's where it's going to plateau and it shouldn't increase significantly beyond that. Achieving a 50 to 85% reduction from 2000 levels, given that population growth, requires a global per capita emission of 0.4 to 1.33 metric tons. Going back to that UN Human Development Index, and if you look at which states in the top half of that 180 states have such low emissions, well, there are only 2. They're Albania and Peru. And they're nowhere near in the highest group. They're in the medium level group. Now, recall from the previous slide that we have some reason to believe that 5 to 11 metric tons per person is required for the highest level of human development. And certainly Peru and Albania are not what we would think of as models of high human development. So in order to achieve the development part of this right to sustainable development, we might be in the position of having to allow states to emit at a rate of 4 to 11 metric tons per person, which is far above the average. Far above the average of 0.4 to 1.3 metric tons. How can that happen? Well, that can only happen if other states, you can only hit the average if many states are above the average, if many other states are far below the average. So what would that mean to domestic policy, say, for the United States? Well, you probably remember that there was once this optimism that we were going to have a comprehensive mitigation policy in the United States, that we were going to build upon the law that was passed in Congress by a law being passed in the Senate. And that law, well, it didn't become a law, but that was called the American Power Act. And it never made it to the floor of the Senate last summer. But what it said was that by 2050, U.S. emissions should be 80% less than 2005 levels. And that would have put, given a constant rate of immigration, assuming that the immigration in the United States is constant, that would have made U.S. and per capita emissions by 2050 somewhere around 3 metric tons. significantly above the global average. Right? Significantly above the 0.4 to 1.33 metric tons. So assume that becomes US law, and we ask ourselves, what would be required then in order to hit the intergenerational target of 2 degrees warming? Well, what would be required would be that many other states, because the US is the second largest emitter of CO2, what would be required is that many other states would have to emit much below that average of 0.4 to 1.33 metric tons. That suggests that as good as the American Power Act was in comparison to existing policy, which is nothing, right? As good as the American Power Act is in comparison to existing policy, it was inconsistent with the right to sustainable development, that it did not go far enough in reducing US CO2 emissions, and that US policy based upon it would violate the right to sustainable development. Either sustainability's got to give or development's got to give. Okay, I think I've said all of that in the first part of the slide. Just recall that this discussion that I've been having, and I've pointed this out in the past, but I'll just underscore it, it's based upon some assumptions. And of course, things can change if the assumptions change. So if there's a technological breakthrough, if it suddenly becomes very cheap to produce energy by means other than emitting fossil fuels, then the picture's different. Right? That's important. And it suggests also that the highest level of human development is the goal. That the goal is, when we talk about the right to sustainable development, we're talking about a human development level that is of the same caliber as those top 38 states. Now, somebody could say that ought not to be the goal, right? That ought not to be the goal of the United Nations Framework Convention's right to sustainable development. But that's going to be a very difficult sell in an international forum in which states are pursuing their development. Because in effect, what that says is, well, the 38 members of that highest group are in, but the rest of you who want to get into that highest level, you're not going to be allowed in. Okay, so I've talked about what I take the institutional conception of the right to be, what the content of the right is. I've talked about the kind of constraints that it puts on policy. I now want to talk about why I think, despite the dramatic CO2 emissions that are required in industrialized countries like the United States, why I think the right is reasonable, and why I think the constraints that it places on policy are reasonable constraints. Now here I'm going to just simply use what I think is a very familiar sense of reasonableness. I'm not going to trot out a sophisticated philosophical understanding of what reasonableness is, or give you a complicated moral argument about what reasonableness is. I'm simply going to say that reasonableness requires parties to honor prior agreements, barring exceptional circumstances. Now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a prior agreement. The United States is a signatory to the convention. Other industrialized states are signers and ratifiers of the convention. In a deliberative framework, in a framework in which we're deliberating about what to do that is governed by certain rules that have been established by prior agreements, a party that knowingly makes proposals that violate the deliberative framework, again, that's in place as a result of prior agreement, is expressing contempt for the other parties in the deliberative framework, and indeed is threatening to undermine the objective that the deliberative framework is seeking to pursue. We get together, we make rules about how we're going to proceed, and somebody says, actually, I'm changing the rules. they're expressing contempt for the process and the parties who have been engaged in establishing the rules, and they threaten to undermine the very objective that the rules are supposed to observe. The convention is such a deliberative framework, and policy and parties that knowingly make proposals that contradict the norms of the convention are failing to take into account the obligations that the legal framework of the convention imposes upon them. Now, I said that there could be exceptions to this idea of reasonableness, and it seems to me that obviously there need to be exceptions, that we can all think of cases in which parties ought not to be honored by prior agreements, or ought not to be honored, ought not to be bound by prior agreements, or ought not to be bound by rules that are in place. If moral disaster would occur by following existing rules, then presumably it wouldn't be unreasonable to break those rules. So in 1994, when there was no agreement to intervene in Rwanda to prevent the Hutus from butchering hundreds of thousands of people, it wouldn't have necessarily been unreasonable, it seems to me, for a party to violate international law and intervene. It's at least not obviously unreasonable in a case like that. We can think of cases in which we're just going to need to break rules that we previously agreed upon because there's an emergency situation. We also, I think, would all agree that there's a role for civil disobedience sometimes to change norms and to change rules. And sometimes the best way, or maybe the only available means for changing rules, is to engage in acts of civil disobedience to break those rules. So this constraint of reasonableness is not an absolute constraint. It's a constraint that can be lifted given the right kinds of conditions. But I submit to you that those conditions don't exist today with respect to climate change negotiations. We're not in a situation in which there would be a moral disaster if parties decided to develop international policy that was consistent with 2 degrees warming. Quite the contrary. It looks like if there's a disaster looming, it's a disaster that's looming because parties are not going to hit, or we're not going to do internationally what we need to do to hit the 2-degree warming limit. We're also not in a context in which a particular party to the United Nations Framework Convention needs to act in a civil disobedient fashion in order to change the norms of the convention. Again, quite the contrary. The convention is a deliberative body. It's subject to change on the basis of the deliberations of the parties, and if parties think that a particular constraint is an inappropriate one, then there's recourse for them to air their grievances in that context. So neither moral disaster nor civil disobedience seem to waive the requirement to follow the pre-existing requirement of the pre-existing norm of the right to sustainable development. Now, how serious the charge of unreasonableness is really depends upon the particular party or person's role in the activity, and also it depends upon the purposes that the prior agreement are meant to achieve. So if you imagine yourself in a circumstance in which you and a bunch of friends are trying to get together to go to eat dinner together, and you've all made an agreement that you want to go out to dinner next Tuesday. So there's this sort of prior agreement in place, right? And you're just trying to decide where to go to eat. And one of your friends constantly disrupts the apparently settled agreement by saying, oh no, actually, I don't want to go to restaurant X, even though we've decided restaurant X. I've got this reason now that I don't want to go to restaurant X, let's go to Y. And you try to accommodate this person 2 or 3 times. In effect, what they're doing is undermining the effort to reach an agreement about where to go to eat supper that evening. What you'd probably want to say is, although that person is a nuisance, the unreasonableness that they're displaying is not a significant moral failing. Why? Well, because you can all go out to eat without that person, right? Their participation isn't essential in order to achieve the goal. And moreover, what they're doing is not such that, or their role in it all, that person's role in it isn't particularly important. I guess that's just to restate what I've just said. That the going out to eat dinner is the purpose of going out to eat dinner isn't undermined by their activity, and their role in it all isn't that significant. That's not the case, it seems to me, when it comes to the major industrialized countries and a climate change agreement. The United States' role in a climate change agreement is vitally important. The United States' role in the climate change agreement is so important because the United States is the second largest global emitter of CO2. So without the United States on board, it's going to be very difficult to achieve the requirement of sustainability, that is, the goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius over the course of this century. Moreover, the purposes of the convention itself are gravely important. The purposes of the convention to sorry, I thought I had a slide on this, but I guess I don't. The purposes of the convention to try to limit warming so as there won't be major reversals to human development in various parts of the world are gravely important. There are some estimates, for example, that suggest that if we proceed on a business as usual CO2 warming path, and of course business as usual, there's a wide range of possibilities there because we may take one or another path under a business as usual scenario, but there are estimates that 50% of the yields in Africa, that farm yields that are due to irrigation solely by means of water, 50% of those yields will be lost by the end of the century. There's worry that 600 million more people will be subject to severe food stress as a result of climate change. So the purposes of the convention are dramatically important, much unlike simply trying to go out together to have a good time. So the charge of being unreasonable in that context strikes me as much more grave than the charge of being unreasonable in the supper example. Let me see, how much time have I used? How much? 10 minutes? Okay, good. There's more that could be said about this, about possible escape routes having to do with illegitimacy. And I could talk about those if you're interested with respect to the convention and whether or not it's plausible to think of the convention itself as illegitimate, but I think I'll skip over that for the time being. And let's go on to point 4 and the final point of the presentation. So here's a criticism of this idea of the right to sustainable development. The idea is that there's been a kind of historical development of human rights. Human rights come onto the scene initially with a concern about people's political and civil rights. And the first human rights documents express that concern. And these, because they came temporally first, some people refer to these as first generation rights. And then people also became concerned about matters that deal with the social and living conditions of people, and whether or not people have access to health care, for example, whether or not people have access to housing, for example. And these are referred to as second generation human rights. And then the third wave comes along where people begin to talk about group rights, where they begin to talk about the rights of cultures to continue to exist. And the right to sustainable development looks like it's part of this package of third generation human rights. Many jurists and philosophers are skeptical of the claims of third generation human rights. They are skeptical of them for a variety of reasons, but there are two main reasons that come to the fore. One reason is that they're worried that if you give rights to groups, it's going to undermine the rights of individuals because it's going to give powers to groups to set policies in a way that are going to frustrate the rights of individuals. So if you give cultural groups rights, for example, it might lead to discrimination against women, as a particular example. The other kind of worry is that there's a kind of inflation of rights that's going on, that we're continuing to assign rights to more and more good states of affairs. And doing that, as there are more and more things that become objects of rights, the value of rights diminishes. And this is a worry if you care a lot about the importance of the other kinds of rights, the rights to civil liberties, the rights to political participation, the rights to adequate housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this might be thought of as a criticism then of the idea that there is a human right to sustainable development because it looks like it's a third generation group right that attaches to states. So I want to close by talking about that criticism. I have 4 replies to the criticism. Okay, the first reply is just to remind you what I take to be the moral importance of the right to sustainable development. Right. What I take to be the moral importance of the right to sustainable development is that it would be unreasonable for parties having agreed upon the right to govern this deliberative framework for setting climate change policy to then knowingly contravene the right by adopting policies that are inconsistent with it. So the moral basis of my claim is this basis of reasonability. That's what I take to be the moral basis of the right to sustainable development. At least that's all we need to say, I think, about it to give it a strong moral foundation. Moreover, I think that recognizing the right to sustainable development is perfectly consistent with safeguarding exceedingly important individual interests. Individual interests in development, the need for energy in order to develop. So, for example, indoor pollution caused by the burning of biomass results in 1.5 million deaths globally per year. Most of those are children. It's as much as or more than the deaths that are caused by AIDS and tuberculosis. So development is meets an exceedingly important individual interest in health. And in Bangladesh, for example, with electrification, studies have shown that individual income has increased on average by 11%, and that 25 childhood deaths in 1,000 have been averted due to the developmental effects of providing indoor education. So the developmental aspect of the right to sustainable development is something that is consistent with safeguarding very important human interests. Indeed, as I said, the Human Development Index captures exceedingly important human interests to income, to health, and to education. But the sustainable part of the right to sustainable development also safeguards very important individual interests. So I've mentioned some of this already. In the business as usual scenarios, we're looking at warming over the course of the century from 1.1 degrees to 6.4 degrees, possibility of very dramatic warming, an ecosystem unlike the human species has developed in. We're looking at sea level rises very conservatively estimated to be on the range of 0.18 to half a meter. I say very conservatively because those estimates are based upon linear estimate of warming over the course of, or the contribution to sea level rise that's caused by warming by looking at the period at the end of the 20th century, and it doesn't take into effect dynamic, rapid melting of ice sheets that can't be taken into effect because nobody knows at this point how to predict them. We're looking at 75 to 250 million Africans exposed to increased water stress. Talked about the yields, the diminished yields, and the increased food insecurity as a result of of climate change. So very important human interests are safeguarded by the sustainable part of the right to sustainable development as well. There's no reason to think then that what we're being asked to do when we recognize a right to sustainable development is forsake important individual interests for the sake of a group right. Moreover, I think that there's a certain virtue from the policy perspective, if not from the philosophical perspective, a certain virtue for looking at this matter in terms of the rights of groups, in particular the rights of states. The virtue is it allows policy discussions to not get caught up in very complicated and I think very intriguing philosophical debates about human rights and the rights of individuals. And there are a number of debates, as I said, that I think are very intriguing that come to the fore once one begins to look at climate change as fundamentally a problem of individual human rights. So, for example, we have the potential for a clash of human rights because there could be human rights that are violated by climate change policy. If you think of water security and health and matters such as this as potential second-generation human rights that could get violated by climate change. But there are also potential clashes or violations of human rights if we pursue a certain sort of mitigation policy that makes development much more expensive. So it could well be that there's an optimal policy out there that will minimize the rights violations, but that's to take a perspective on rights that, at least philosophically, is controversial. That's to say that rights are objects that can be maximized, and that what we ought to be in the business of doing when we engage in policy is maximizing rights. That might be the right perspective with rights, but it flies in the face of what many philosophers think of when they think of rights as having a more deontological status that places constraints on optimal policy. Moreover, because we're talking about future persons' rights when we think about the dangers of climate change, there are 4 important conceptual problems that arise that have to do with their non-existence and their contingent existence. So can we say that the rights of non-existent persons place us under duties? I mean, people who might exist 100 and 200 years from now. Moreover, if our policy determines who will exist 100 years from now or 200 years from now, is it wrong? Is the policy that we pursue wrong if the people who would exist wouldn't exist but for the policy? This is the familiar version of what some of you, I think, have studied as the non-identity problem that Derek Parfit has examined in detail. Is there a manner of avoiding the violation of their rights if they wouldn't exist but for the policy that we pursue? And finally, how serious would the rights violation be of these future persons if they wouldn't exist but for the violations, and aren't they likely to waive their rights and say that actually it wasn't a big deal at all? Now, I don't mean to suggest that there aren't philosophically respectable and compelling answers to these problems. In fact, I've argued that there are. My point is a simpler point about policy, that it's a good thing if policy can avoid these issues. It's a good thing if policy can avoid getting entangled in these issues precisely because they're so complicated, because they're so difficult to work out, and the answers are controversial. If you look at this as primarily an issue of the rights of groups, namely the rights of states to sustainable development, you don't have to get embroiled in these interesting and intriguing philosophical issues. And then finally, I would say, if the first 3 points are correct, if I've convinced you about the first 3 answers that I've given you with respect to this criticism, then I don't really care whether you call it a human right. In fact, I haven't really at any time during the course of this presentation argued that it is a human right. If you don't see it as a human right, as you see it as simply a right that states have in virtue of a convention, that's fine. In fact, the moral work that's done by the conception, as I've expressed it, is based upon viewing it that way. It's based upon viewing it as the matter of prior agreement and not as a matter of an independently justified and inherent individual, or not individual, but independently justified and inherent human right. That's enough, it seems to me, to make the moral case. The right to sustainable development is an important right, that violating it is to engage in morally grave, unreasonable activity, and that's going to constrain both international climate policy and the climate policy of particular states. And I think I've gone on long enough, so I'll stop there and see what you would like to talk about.